I stood in a snowy field with hundreds of other prisoners. It was bitterly cold, and we were completely depressed. The crowd lined us up in 6 rows, facing forward, with our hands raised in a gesture of absolute submission. I was in the middle of the 4th row. We were looking around, trying to figure out what would happen next, when 2 half-track armored personnel carriers approached us. Soon after them, grinding their tracks, another one rolled up and stood between them. A German got up from the 3rd transport, took aim with a pistol and fired. This served as a signal to the machine gunners and other armored personnel carriers. They opened fire on us with their MG-42s. With a rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute, we didn't stand a chance. Finally, the shooting stopped and there was an ominous silence. Then the Panzer Grenadiers climbed out of their KFC, 251s. These were big guys, laughing and joking. They methodically completed the job. What can I say? The Hitler Youth had happy days. Luckily, I survived and the cleaners didn't notice me. When I came to my senses, I was scared. There was an ominous silence. Suddenly someone shouted, "Forward!" and several guys, who had been pretending to be dead all this time, jumped up and started running. MG-42 came to life again. It was a deep winter, and it would soon get dark. I was warmed by the still warm bodies of my dead comrades, so I decided not to move, but just lie there, face down, cursing the fate that brought me to the crossroads in Malmedy on that dark December day. Secretly, I felt in my pocket for my treasured photo of Jane and Peter. This thought warned me soon I would be with them. I grew up in the German-speaking part of Wisconsin. In those days, we Huns kept to ourselves, creating small farming communities where German was still the everyday language, even if your family had been here for 2 generations. That's why most of us were bilingual. However, the Great War changed the attitude of our neighbors towards the Germans, and we all began to pronounce our names with a distinct English accent. That's why I was Bill and not Wilhelm. Our community was self-sufficient, and order is what the Germans are best at maintaining. Therefore, even despite the Great Depression, my childhood was not as difficult as that of city kids. Of course, we made some sacrifices, but there was always food on the table and the school was good. It was there that I discovered my talent for writing. I didn't study this, ideas just flashed in my head, and the words themselves lined up in lines like the carriages of a passing train. In high school, I won an essay competition, which caught the attention of Max Schlemiel. Yes, it was Schlemiel. He inherited this unlucky surname from some distant ancestor. But Max himself was a guy with a head. He owned and published a local newspaper. One sultry July day, I was sitting on the porch of our house, sipping lemonade, wondering what to do with my life. And then Max appeared. I didn't notice how he came. He must have come through the alley behind our big colonial house. In those days, we walked more often in alleys than in streets. He immediately stated, "Bill, I have a job for you." That was helpful. I had no idea what I wanted to do. Well, which 18-year-old knows this? One thing was clear, some kind of further. I frowned. I don't want to be a newspaper delivery boy. Well, what else could the owner of the newspaper offer? But Max laughed. No, I need a reporter. I read your essay. I think you have the potential to work as a junior correspondent. This intrigued me. College was out of the question. We didn't have that kind of money, and I didn't want to become a field worker or join the WPA. My father worked as an organizer in a local farmers association, but I didn't intend to meet the needs of farmers either. So I asked carefully, "How much do you pay and when do you start?" Max replied, "You can start tomorrow. For a regular article, I pay $1. If you get an opinion column, I pay $2. It was good money in 37. What exactly does a junior correspondent do? I'll give you an ID, times, and then you yourself will look for topics for reporting." He noticed the doubt on my face. How the hell do I search for news? Sometimes I get tips and I send someone to check on them. But first you have to show that you can find stories on your own. The next morning I came to the editorial office, neatly combed. It was a dilapidated wooden building on the main street, not far from the cinema. The entire staff consisted of 2 old men and 1 woman. This was our great news center. Two men made up the entire press group, and Mrs. Eldridge was Max's secretary. She was about 85 years old and looked like a wrinkled nut with whipped cream on top of her head. But she had plenty of energy, and she held the newspaper in her fist, like Pershing held her army. She muttered suspiciously, "And what do you want here?" I could have been offended, but that's how she talked to everyone. "Max wants to talk to me about work. He's in the hot spot. You can go there," but I doubt he was serious. "How old are you?" 12. I straightened up. 21. And he headed towards the exit. It was a sweltering, sticky morning, a typical day in Wisconsin in July. There were no air conditioners back then, so when I entered a cafe with a self-explanatory name, Hot Spot, it was as hot inside as outside. The hot spot was a gathering place for the entire area, so it was unclear whether Max was there just for a cup of coffee or to dig up another local story. He sat in a booth with Barbara Pedersen, the owner, and Dr. Morton. They chatted pleasantly while Barbara's 3-year-old daughter, Dot, diligently entertained the customers, busily passing menus from table to table. A small but extremely purposeful girl. When I approached, all three turned their heads towards me. Max smiled. "Sit down, Bill. We were just talking about you." This sounded alarming. What did I do? I didn't do anything. I blurted out. They laughed. "Relax," Max chuckled. "I just told them I hired you. So if you sniff out news, consider it an official assignment." I grinned. "So you're saying that I can just follow my curiosity?" The doctor nodded. "I think he has the makings of an excellent reporter." Barbara added, "And you can start right here. Nothing happens in this town that doesn't go through the hot spot." It was hard to disagree. Barbara knew more secrets than the Sphinx herself. At that moment, my girlfriend Maggie burst into the cafe. All the local teenagers were hanging out here, and she was clearly looking for me. Sounds were coming from the Silverton radio in the kitchen window. "Don't sit under the apple tree, Glenn Miller." Maggie confidently walked past the counter in my direction, but stopped first at Betty Morin. Betty had been her best friend since school. She and her boyfriend, Jed Sharp, seemed like the perfect couple. Betty was considered the first beauty in the city, and Jed was said to be smarter than everyone else. I don't know if this is true, but I knew for sure that I myself was not a genius. After a short conversation with Betty and Jed, Maggie turned to me. She was chewing 3 juicy fruit records at once, and her eyes were sparkling with excitement. It is worth noting that it was only 9 in the morning. Maggie was an experienced girl and taught me a lot. Her past didn't bother me. I wasn't going to marry her, even though she hinted at it. She was not a dazzling beauty like Betty, but she had a sweet face, dark brown hair, styled in a neat bob, and huge brown eyes. And of course, she had prominent breasts. I lived to snuggle up to these miracles, like soft headphones, and say, "BRRRRR," a suffocating but pleasant process. Maggie grinned. "Hey, Ace, that's what everyone called me. How about a refreshing swim?" The essence of her proposal was much less innocent than it sounded. I tried to brush it off. "I'm discussing work with Max here." Her eyes lit up even brighter. If I got a job, it meant that I could soon become a suitable candidate for marriage. Max, having fun, confirmed. "Yes, Bill will be our new junior reporter." I quickly stood up. "I think it's time to start looking for a topic for an article." "When do you need your first job?" "The sooner the better," Max answered. "We released the issue on Friday. It was Monday. 3 or 4 days is enough to come up with something." Maggie pulled my hand. "Come on, it's getting hot in here." Hot, that's for sure. We walked out to her old 1931 Ford convertible. This car appeared to her as if out of nowhere after her 18th birthday. I knew Maggie had an unknown source of income. There were rumors that she had a wealthy patron, but I didn't care. The main thing is that she always had extra money, which we both happily spent. We went to Dell's Pond, where the trees provided shade. Soon we were swimming naked, and 15 minutes later, we got to the shore. Maggie was an experienced lover, and as soon as she emerged from the water, she lay down on the blanket without hesitation, spread out in all her glory. She raised her head and gave me a searing look. There was no point in hiding, I was already ready. I crossed a short distance, and without further ado we merged into one. Later in the evening. Of course, I couldn't resist and followed her. It was not a jealous impulse, rather, professional curiosity. It became clear to me that my girlfriend has some kind of shadow life, and I wanted to figure it out. This is where I realized I really had a knack for reporting. Maggie lived in a cozy area on the east side of the city, among the old stone houses where the local nobility settled. Her father was an important figure in local politics, so it didn't seem strange to me when someone approached their house. Grover Cleveland Ebenschliger. He's been mayor for as long as I can remember. However, something else became strange. Later 30 seconds he walked out, and Maggie hung on his arm like an elegant accessory. It looked much more like a date than a business meeting. She's 22. He is 57. They headed towards Elks Lodge, which is on the outskirts of the city. However, I knew for sure that there was no Elks meeting this evening. I'm lucky. They left the car in a dark alley behind the building. The sun had not yet set, and I saw an opportunity for a sensation. In the glove compartment of his father's Chevy lay his beloved Argus C3. He kept it handy for imprinting special moments, and this moment was more special than ever. I parked at the end of the street, waited a few minutes, and then crept up to the side of the building. Like all commercial buildings in this city, the Elks Hall was built of cheap white boards with large windows to provide at least some ventilation on hot summer nights. Familiar sounds were coming from one of the small offices at the back of the building. I heard exactly the same ones about 8 hours ago. I made my way to the main office and saw Maggie and Ebenschliger there. There was plenty of light, so I took some elegant photos. Well, they were neat if your goal is to get the scoop, which is something that never falls on a young reporter's head on his first day on the job. They were still doing it when I got back to the car. Maggie was a different person when she slid into the booth across from me a few hours later. Her hair was pulled back into 2 ponytails, making her resemble a Springer Spaniel, and her cheeks were flushed. She was just glowing after good sex when she said, "Sorry I'm late, darling. I was a little late." "Well, yes, of course," I said casually. "It's okay. Just wanted to ask, how do you know Grover?" Maggie looked worried and asked, "You mean the mayor?" "Exactly him." Maggie looked like she was trying to figure out exactly how much I knew. "What makes you think that I know him?" "The thing is, I kind of saw you in his car a little earlier when he was driving towards the Elks Hall." She smiled with relief. "Oh, this. He just gave me a ride to work. I'm doing some errands for him. He hired me to clean everything up there. That's where I get my money, my love." So that's the thing. At least she was honest. Although she clearly put in order not only documents. I asked with sincere curiosity, "How did you meet him?" She laughed. "He and my father run this city." Her old man was the county treasurer. I didn't ask when exactly she started sleeping with him. This was clearly new to her, which, undoubtedly, coincided with the appearance of her car. I felt neither cold nor hot from the fact that Maggie was distributing her generosity throughout the city. As I said, I had no intention of marrying her, but I also didn't like the idea of eating after someone else. She looked at me with that familiar hungry look and said seductively, "We have somewhere to go, don't we?" I replied, "That's what I wanted to say. Max wants me to come early tomorrow morning, so we'll have to cancel tonight." Maggie looked extremely disappointed. It was strange. She just got her share of pleasure. I wanted to talk to Max before I did anything with Maggie. The tape in my pocket will certainly change the dynamics of our relationship, so I said, as lustfully as possible, "I'll change your world tomorrow after talking with Max." This is probably how it will be, just not in the way she thought. A couple of days passed, and I went through 3 grueling dates with Maggie before Max called me. He said he wanted to see me. I was in high spirits when I walked into his office and lounged in my chair. He stood up, closed the door, and sat down again. I said carefree, "Well, how do you like my first article? With photographs, by the way." You haven't had this kind of news for a long time, right? Max was sorting through the papers on the table and said, "Good news and bad. Where do we start?" I was still in a good mood. "Let's start with the bad ones," Max said. "I don't publish it." I bulged my eyes. "What?" Max answered calmly. "This city is too delicately balanced for your article to destroy everything." I looked at him point blank. "You showed it to Ebenschliger." I didn't even bother to point out how crudely he mixed his metaphors. "Of course," said Max, "I should live here too, but there is also good news." I asked contemptuously. "Which ones, O great sage?" Max laughed. "What you gave me made me a man who holds all the cards. Ebenschliger and his cronies understand this and are ready to play by my rules." Then he paused and added pointedly, "But on one condition, and you might even like it, because it will get you out of this city." That's how I ended up at Columbia University's School of Journalism, funded entirely by the mayor and his shady friends. Blackmail is too harsh a word. I like to think that the influential people of this town simply sponsored an ambitious young man. Whatever the real reason for their generosity, Max put me on a train to New York within a week. It seems that my parents even breathed a sigh of relief. Maggie was beside herself with grief. I didn't tell her exactly how she helped me get into the Express career. She gave me an amazing send-off, over and over and over again, to the point where I thought I would never want sex again in my life. Overall, Maggie was good-natured. All she wanted in life was to raise a bunch of kids. She will certainly make a good wife for some wealthy burgher. But getting married in small-town Wisconsin was the ninth circle of hell for me. My worldview expanded greatly during the time I spent in that big brick building on Broadway. My studies propelled me forward a couple of centuries, right to the forefront of American journalism. Now my world was Runyon and Winchell, Lippman and Grantland Rice. But of course, the journalist turned writer who shone above all was Ernest Hemingway. I wanted to be just like Ernie, and my professors thought I had talent. So when I graduated from Columbia, I had many job offers to choose from. I chose the position of foreign correspondent in the Post. This is how Hemingway made a living while he was writing. And the sun rises in Paris. At that time, the New York Post was a liberal newspaper that published articles by people such as Elena Roosevelt and Drew Pearson. But all attention was focused on events in Europe. And as for me, this was the most suitable place for an ambitious young man who wanted to make a name for himself. I arrived in Southampton on board Aquitaine just in time for the Blitz. I was lucky in this regard. Most people wouldn't appreciate spending the night on the subway, but I came to report. So I started conducting personal interviews with my dungeon neighbors and submitting articles to App and to my editor at Post to Wexler. Residents of my hometown would not care about the topics of my articles. They were still living in the 19th century. But the Manhattan crowd loved my reporting, and I began to gain a reputation. I was 23 years old, living in a small flat in Russell Square and full of self-confidence when fate again abruptly changed my course. Every evening we went down to the subway, closer to darkness. That's when they appeared, he 111. Deaf wow. The 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns served as an alarm clock, signaling that it was time to take cover. It was a rainy November evening, and I was looking for my next victim to interview. I focused on older people and mothers with children. Their stories resonated most with liberal readers post who loved to bask in the suffering of others. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. I made my way among the huddled people, sleeping or simply passing the time on the concrete floor of the subway. Suddenly, a face rose to meet my gaze, and at the same moment, a parachute mine exploded nearby. The roar of the explosion and the shaking of the tunnel walls perfectly underscored the feeling that my life had changed forever. She was of average height, about 5 feet 4 inches, with a trim figure, wearing a dark gray button-down cardigan and a gray pleated skirt. She sat on a tartan blanket, her long, slender legs dangling over the platform, talking quietly to a little boy. The British are famous for their adorable children, and this little boy was the very definition of a blonde, blue-eyed cherub. He had a golden helmet of thick hair and a face full of innocence as he listened intently to his mother telling him a story. I sat down next to her and said in the friendliest tone, "Hello, my name is Ace." She stopped talking to the boy and turned her head towards me. Irritation from the interference was visible in her eyes. She said, "Could you leave us? My son and I would like some privacy." I laughed and said, "I'm not pestering you, madam. I'm a reporter for the New York Post, and I write about the Blitz from the point of view of ordinary people. Do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions?" The boy spoke in his sweet, childish voice. "Oh, Mom, can I? We'll be in the newspaper." I smiled at the baby and with slight irony said to his mother, "This will only take a couple of minutes, and as far as I can see, you don't have anything more important to do, right?" At that moment, another parachute mine exploded nearby, and everyone around them cowered in fear. She smiled back at me. Now I understood where the boy got such angelic features from his mother was a real beauty. She said hesitantly, "Okay, but I don't understand what could be interesting about me or Peter. Readers might not be interested, but yes to me." I didn't ask if she lived nearby. Only those whose houses were located near the station took shelter in the metro. No one would risk running across the city in the rain of 250-kilogram bombs. I took out my notebook and asked the standard first question, "Where does her husband serve?" I just assumed he was at the front. This was an unfortunate question because her husband did not serve anywhere. He was buried near Arras. He died during the unsuccessful campaign of the British Expeditionary Force before the evacuation from Dunkirk in May 1940. It's been 6 months already. Both looked sad. I said, "Oh God, I'm so sorry." She made a face that expressed the severity of her losses and said quietly, "We must hold on. You need to be strong." It was at this point that my simple interest turned into something much more. In a sense, this woman personified the spirit of the British people. She didn't start this war, but she was going to endure it without complaint until those who unleashed it were punished. I said, "If you want, I'll leave you alone. But it seems to me that all young mothers who have lost their husbands would want to hear your story. Your thoughts, feelings, your experience are important for any woman who finds herself in a similar situation." She looked at me skeptically. Then I added, "I want to put your story in a broader context to support women going through the same thing. And I won't publish anything without your approval. But it seems to me that every widow left with children needs to know that she is not alone." She looked at me in surprise and said, "That's exactly how I feel. I am the only widow on our street who still has a small child, and I feel so lonely. The future scares me." Then she became embarrassed and added, "I'm not complaining, if anything." I asked, "Have you always lived in London?" She said, "I grew up in Shepherd's Bush. But before the war, Nigel and I lived in Stepney. He joined the 60th London Anti-Aircraft Regiment. We thought it was safer than the trenches. But part of them came under attack from the Blitzkrieg, and he was killed a month after his conscription. Like this, I thought, this is a price each of us may have to pay." The woman became increasingly sad as she told her story, and at some point she simply burst into tears. Her little son, still just a child, hugged his mother and pressed against her, trying to console her. I was an American. For me, this European war was their problem. But watching this picture, I felt something shrinking inside me. I was a journalist. I had to remain impartial. But the sight of this woman and her son, who sat and cried in the subway, touched me to the depths of my soul. I clumsily reached out and hugged them both, the way one would comfort complete strangers. I didn't try to take advantage of the moment. I didn't strive for intimacy. I just wanted to give them some warmth and support. The touch seemed to be exactly what she needed right now. She turned to me and, still crying, buried her face in my shoulder. I felt awkward and didn't know what to say, so I just slapped her on the back and muttered, well, everything is fine." Honestly, it's a pretty stupid phrase, but I was a journalist, not a priest. I have never been known for deep thinking. People around began to look at us with interest, and I was already starting to feel completely out of place when she finally pulled herself together. I pulled out a clean handkerchief from my pocket and handed it to her. She wiped her eyes, then gently wiped her son's cheeks and wanted to return the handkerchief to me. "Keep it for yourself," I said. She smiled awkwardly. "Sorry, sometimes it just gets too hard." I replied, "Everything is fine. I'm glad I was there to support you in some way." She looked at me differently. There was something warm in her eyes. "Jane," she said. I looked at her in surprise. "My name is Jane," she clarified, "and this is Peter." Peter extended his tiny hand and, shaking mine like a gentleman, said clearly, "Nice to meet you, sir." He was a very well-mannered boy. Then I realized that I still had my hand on his mother's shoulder, and I quickly removed it. Jane smiled again. "Everything is fine. It was nice." I was about to answer something in the same spirit, but then the all-clear signal sounded, and the entire crowd of people in the subway began to rise to the surface. I could sit with this woman all night, but the damn Luftwaffe decided they had enough for today. We rose with everyone else. A picture of chaos and destruction opened up around us. The Germans dropped parachute mines on the Docklands that night, and the southeast wind blew them straight towards Stepney. A parachute mine contains about a ton of explosives. There was nothing left of entire neighborhoods but ruins. One of these blocks was the one where Jane's apartment was located. Now there was just a gaping crater. Think about it. Jane just told me that she recently lost her husband, and now she has lost everything else. So I was not surprised when she knelt down on the wet asphalt, covered her face with her hands, and began to sob. Peter, like a real little hero, pressed her head to his chest and tried to calm her down. "Everything is fine, Mommy. We'll sleep on the lawn. It will be fun, just like going on a hike." "No, damn it, not Will." I rented an apartment in Russell Square. The time was approaching 11 in the evening, and transport began to run again. I carefully lifted Jane to her feet, patted Peter on the head, and said firmly, "Both of you will come to me." We were squeezed into a crowded tube car on the Piccadilly line when I said, "Have you ever thought that I am doing this not because of some duty, but because I feel affection for you?" I myself could not understand where this feeling came from. All my life I have been free and independent, but their well-being now seemed more important to me than my own. "Peter is the best boy I have ever met, and you are the best friend and companion a man could ask for." I saw what was on her mind, so I quickly added, "This is not romance, and I have no plans for your body. This is something different. I don't know what to call it, but I can no longer imagine my life without you two. You fill it with warmth and meaning." I watched as my words seemed to disappear into the depths of her thoughts. Jane stood motionless, studying me intently like a cat. And then it occurred to me, she really looks like a cat with those huge eyes, perfectly proportioned face, and smooth, graceful movements. Finally, she said, "After Nigel died, I came to terms with the idea that I would be alone. Peter may look strong and confident, but in reality, he is just a brave boy trying to hide his pain." She looked away and added quietly, "Nigel has instilled self-discipline in him since childhood, and now he is trying to be worthy of his father. He knows how much I miss my husband and doesn't want to show me how hard it is for him. He has always been like this, selfless. This is his nature." Her words touched me. Most mothers are so absorbed in their own grief that they do not notice what is happening in the soul of their child. Jane looked at me with a warm smile and said, "But since you appeared in our lives, I see changes in him. He became different. There was hope in him, as if he had finally seen the light at the end of the tunnel. And this is your merit." She paused, then added, "Maybe it's because you're American. There is no doubt in your mind that we have a future ahead of us. That all we need is to just get through this temporary inconvenience. And that's probably why, Peter, and I feel the same way about you." It was more than I expected to hear. I was frankly upset when she added, "But I don't love you." I frowned and she laughed. "Give me some time. We've only known each other for one day." Then she looked at me carefully with her piercing cat eyes and said, "But you are beautiful, strong, and next to you, I feel safe. I can imagine life with you, how we share hardships and joys." And smiling a little coquettishly, she added, "Give me 2 more days, maybe then I will decide that you are my Prince Charming." That's how we became a family, Jane, Peter, and me. We spent a happy holiday season in my tiny apartment. Naturally, we didn't have a Christmas tree, but I found it in ruins after the bombing pot of fern, and Jane decorated it with garlands of popcorn strung on a string. For Christmas, under this tree, there were 2 good, warm, waterproof winter coats for Jane and Peter, and in the morning we even went to service in St. Bride's. But my apartment was cramped. She was small even for one. So after the new year, I went looking for housing suitable for my family. So we ended up in a house on Kensington High Street. It was a neat, small 2-family house, 7 detached, in a good area. I spent on it all your savings on it. But what's the difference? There was a war going on. I received a base salary from the Associated Press and a war zone supplement from the Post. So money wasn't a problem. And then, thanks to Hitler, in 1941 the real estate market in London was in deep crisis. The Germans bombed until not the West End, and even when they accidentally wandered over to our side, their bombing was no longer so intense. The most important now, Peter had own bedroom, which means Jane and I too. Life in London went on as usual, even despite the war. People were looking for proximity. There were pubs open, nightclubs were open in full force, and views on relationships have changed a lot since the time of Queen Victoria. Random connections were okay, but not for Jane and me. Our union was not about romance and about something else, because loneliness is unnatural. Human pack creature. Our ability to unite and take care of each other, that's what made us who we are. That's why the need for a family is staked in our genes. And that's exactly what happened with the 3 of us. But the problem was that Jane and I didn't meet, fell in love, and had a baby. We found each other later when life already made its moves. And now we had to build our bridge from scratch. I thought Jane was worried about how she would live alone now. Oh, how wrong I was. I told her that the Post deposited my salary directly into our joint account, so she and Peter had nothing to worry about. I did not say that I bequeathed all my property to her. Talking about the will could bring up 2 painful memories for her. Jane and I slept in the front bedroom on the 2nd floor, and Peter slept in the back, overlooking our small garden. We had another room downstairs, which I used as an office. It was already late. I was just finishing the last preparations for the trip. I was putting my portable Royal Quiet Deluxe into its case when Jane suddenly appeared. She was wearing her old, worn-out robe. She quietly closed the door and, raising her finger to her lips, motioned for me to be silent. Her golden eyes burned with fire. I stood up to meet her, puzzled. She grabbed me by the back of my head, pulled me towards her, and captured my lips with a hot, open kiss. It was an incredible feeling. I broke the kiss and looked into her eyes. Deep, smart, dark. She looked at me just as intently, and determination and thirst were visible in her gaze. Now I understood why she came to my office and did not wait upstairs next to Peter's bedroom. It will be loud. Beneath all her English restraint and self-control, there was an incredibly sensual, passionate woman. She opened her robe. She was completely naked underneath. I took a step back and saw her naked for the first time. In the faint light of the night lamp, Jane looked perfect. She was graceful, petite, a real porcelain doll. Her eyes rolled back, and her voice, broken with excitement, sounded hoarse. "Take me. Do it now." Those were the last articulate words I heard from her for the next 45 minutes. She didn't need romance. I felt a moment of confusion again. How could such a reserved woman be so wild? But my inner voice interrupted my hesitation. "Stop thinking, wimp, and do it." After our sex, Jane lay motionless. I leaned towards her, but she opened one eye and whispered with a sly smile. "Looks like I surprised you. I surprised myself too. I never thought I was capable of this. You see, when I love, I give everything. This is my gift to you." Then she added, quite calmly, "So now we're heading towards marriage, if you want me." "Want her?" I grinned. "Then lead me to the altar. Tomorrow." We got married early the next morning. It happened at the Church of Our Lady of the Victory, which was around the corner on the High Street. We were not Catholics, but Father Brown had been through the trenches of the Great War. He understood our situation and turned a blind eye to all church demands. The only people present at the ceremony were Jane, myself, the priest, his ward Bunty, and Mrs. McCarthy, the parish secretary, as witnesses. Jane and I shared a best man, the brightest 9-year-old in the world. Peter was in his church suit, his blonde hair was neatly combed, and his beautiful childish face expressed romantic nobility as he handed me the ring. I bought it just 3 weeks after Jane and I first met because I knew this moment would come. Peter looked at me with admiration, simply glowing with joy. It seemed to me that my love for him could not become stronger. Peter must have been a very lonely boy without a father. Jane looked stunning in an understated, yet expensive navy blue jersey dress. It fit perfectly on her slender figure. We bought it in advance, knowing that one day she would need something dressy, and this case turned out to be exactly that. As I slipped the ring onto Jane's finger, she kept her eyes on me, her golden eyes reflecting endless devotion. They talked about her deep love, and I tried to show how much it meant to me. And then it was all over. In less than a year, I went from single newspaper guy to married man with a family, and I couldn't be happier or more relaxed. We celebrated at the Goat Inn and then returned home to pack my things. I did not skimp on a taxi, which took us to London Pool, where my ship was being loaded. Jane and Peter were supposed to return home after I got on board. I was going to Berlin for an indefinite period. For Jane, it was almost the same as the last time she saw a man off to war. She knew that I would do everything possible to get back to her, but she still looked scared. Peter tried to be brave as always, but when it was his turn to say goodbye, he couldn't help it and started crying. I hugged my little hero and said, "I'll come back. Take care of your mother while I'm gone." Peter wiped his tears, looked at me courageously, and replied, "Certainly." Then he hesitated and, a little embarrassed, asked, "Can I call you father?" These words touched me to the core. I hugged him tightly and said, "There is no person in the world who would be prouder to bear this title than me, son." We hugged again, and then my smart and noble boy pulled himself together again. He straightened up and, with the expression of a true knight, said, "You can count on me, father." I took my things and stepped onto the ramp. At the top, I turned around for the last time. They stood side by side, as stoic as ever. They waved at me and then turned and walked towards the taxi. The last thing I saw was Peter's face pressed against the rear window before the car disappeared behind the warehouse. The Berlin I arrived in was like Imperial Rome, only with swastikas. The buildings were monumental. There was a sense of self-importance and ostentatious grandeur in the air. The Nazis turned the entire city into a cult of personality. Portraits of party leaders, especially Hitler, were everywhere. Red, white, and black flags decorated every corner. Legendary streets such as Unter den Linden und Friedrichstraße were buzzing with activity, and lively crowds went about their business as if the war had never happened. Even the Tiergarten remained open. I arrived at Anhalter Station early on Wednesday morning after an unexpectedly comfortable overnight journey from Munich. The Associated Press booked me a room at the Kaiserhof Hotel on Wilhelmplatz, just a stone's throw from the Reich Chancellery. Howard K. Smith, one of Murrow's men, and Dick Hotlet of the United Press also lived there, or rather, Hotlet spent most of his time in Moabit prison. He began reporting on what the Nazis were doing to the Jews, and Himmler immediately put him in a cell on charges of espionage. Hotlet was released after Roosevelt's intervention, and he hurried to leave Germany. But the stories he told about his time spent visiting Himmler and the Gestapo served as a clear warning to me not to get caught. The Nazis had their own methods of dealing with freethinkers. I was a new correspondent with Associated Press accreditation, which gave me the right to meet with the Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels himself. I entered a huge, richly decorated office with floor-to-ceiling windows. At the massive table sat what looked like a child in a miniature Nazi uniform. Thank God I didn't laugh, because this baby was the Reich Minister of Propaganda himself. Goebbels was tiny, only 5 feet 4 inches tall. Therefore, he did not get up from the table to hide his physical unrepresentability. He even seemed to be sitting on a phone book or something to make himself look less comical. Our meeting lasted an hour. During this time, this evil little goblin passionately told me about the ultimate solution for Jews, communists, and anyone who did not live up to the Aryan standard. I did not remind him that he, like Hitler, Himmler, and that fat pig Goering, did not live up to the Nazi ideal at all. I knew from Hotelet stories about the camps where people who dared to tell the truth were sent. The summer of 1941 was the zenith of the Third Reich, both in weather and in military successes. The Germans really took the Russians by surprise and, according to their own reports, were advancing towards Moscow at a tremendous pace. And the Reich Chancellery was obsessed with convincing the Americans not to interfere in the war. Hitler himself fought on the front lines in World War I and knew full well what happened when the Americans entered the conflict. Therefore, I was given lectures every day about the power of the Wehrmacht and its easy victories. Of course, I did not send this nonsense to Wexler, because it was all part of the big lie. The term big lie was coined by Hitler himself in Mein Kampf, but it was Goebbels who promoted it. The essence of the method is simple. You claim something so crazy that no sane person would invent it. Therefore, it must be true. And then you reinforce this lie by eliminating anyone who says otherwise with the help of the Gestapo. It was an ingenious but monstrous mass brainwashing. That is why ordinary Germans could live next door to death camps and not even think about what was happening outside their walls. But despite all this, I could not write about what I saw. The Gestapo checked every message I sent over the app line and, of course, corrected any errors. They also made it clear that they were monitoring my personal communications and listening to all my calls, so I could either churn out Nazi propaganda or find another way to do my job. I kept the fact that I knew German a secret. This gave me the opportunity to eavesdrop on conversations, because the Germans did not even suspect that an American could understand their language. But I wanted to do real reporting, so I went back to my old method of writing feature stories and started interviewing ordinary citizens. Before that, it seemed to me that all Germans were ardent Nazis. However, chatting in a cafe on Friedrichstrasse, I realized that Berliners are not much different from the residents of my hometown in Wisconsin. They just wanted to live their lives, and since the Nazi regime did not worsen their situation in any way, they did not care who was in power. Berlin still shone with lights at night, as if at a fair. Of course, British bombers showed up from time to time, but their raids were only minor troubles compared to what the Luftwaffe did in London. No one in Berlin could even imagine what their city would become in 4 years. During my 6 weeks in Berlin, I made several acquaintances, and one of them saved my life. Kurt Ettinger worked as a translator for us, but in reality, he was a minor Gestapo official assigned to spy on American journalists. He had been a Berlin policeman before the rise of the Nazis, and his transfer to the Gestapo was more a bureaucratic formality than a consequence of ideological commitment. In fact, he hated his bosses. Early one morning in mid-August, I was just beginning to wake up when there was a frantic knocking on my hotel room door. I, not yet fully awake, opened the door, and Ettinger stood on the threshold. He literally burst into the room, slammed the door, and blurted out in German, "You need to get out of here immediately. They are coming to arrest you." I still didn't fully understand what was happening. "What? It's because of your interviews. They found out that you speak German." Then it was like I was struck by lightning. He said it in German. Before that, we always communicated in English, because I supposedly did not know German. This means that one of my interlocutors reported me to the Gestapo. It flashed through my head. Why the hell was I even doing this? They'll think I'm a spy. I quickly got dressed, went downstairs, and caught a taxi. I didn't take anything with me. There was no time to get ready. On the way to Grand Central Station, I tried to come up with a plan. The Gestapo would immediately realize that I had escaped and would monitor all trains going to Switzerland, the standard route for American escapes. So I needed a non-standard path. And then I remembered Denmark. This country was considered a protectorate of the Nazis. The king formally remained in power, and the Gestapo did not have complete freedom of action there. In addition, the road to Copenhagen was much shorter than to Switzerland. The decision came naturally. As soon as I got to the station, I leisurely walked up to the ticket office and bought a ticket for the next morning train to Hamburg. He was leaving right now, which was good for me. The only inconvenience was that the train was almost full, and I got a seat in second class, which meant I had to stand. But standing until Hamburg was much better than ending up in the hands of the Gestapo. I literally jumped into the last carriage when the train had already started moving. The trip to Hamburg took half a day. As I expected, the carriage was crowded. I had to stand for some time, but when one seat became available, I managed to sit down faster than some fat burger. As Sherman would say, war is hell. The train to Copenhagen left from Hamburg, and I managed to get a first-class ticket. It was already after midnight when the train reached the Danish border. Suddenly, he braked sharply, loud shouts in German, and the hiss of steam were heard. Then the train moved again. I had no doubt. The Gestapo was on board. They combed the carriages as we slowly drove into Padborg, the first town on the Danish side. When the train slowed to walking speed, I opened the compartment door, jumped out, and rolled down the embankment. There was immediate noise in the carriage. My neighbors screamed, calling for the Gestapo. But I had already disappeared into the maze of the railway junction. It was still dark, and I managed to hide before the flashlights began to comb the area where I had just been. I hid in a guardhouse near the tracks and waited until it began to get light. Then I went to the bus stop next to the station. I had enough Reichsmarks, and in Denmark they were accepted without problems. So I soon made it to the main bus terminal in Padborg and caught the morning flight to Copenhagen. The escape was surprisingly easy, probably because they expected me to run in a different direction. The Gestapo did not control telephone lines in Denmark, and I was able to call App at the receiving party's expense. Wexler realized the seriousness of the situation and told him to wait while he made a few calls. I contacted him a couple of hours later, and he gave me the name of an American merchant ship docked in the port of Copenhagen. The journey back to London took a couple of days. But when we entered the harbor, Jane and Peter were already waiting for me. I was overjoyed. Obviously, Wexler told them about my return, otherwise they would not have known when to expect me. In those days, communication was difficult. There were only telegrams, and because of the war, it was almost impossible to make long-distance calls. The Associated Press had its own transatlantic line, but for ordinary people, news arrived with a 2-week delay. Later, this delay played an important role, but more on that later. Jane and Peter were not people given to violent displays of emotion. They are English, after all, so they didn't rush to meet me. But I saw Peter literally dancing with impatience, and Jane's face was flooded with tears. I hugged her fragile but strong body tightly and kissed her. Then he dropped to one knee and pulled Peter into his arms. I had to leave very unexpectedly, so I didn't have time to bring you anything but interesting stories, I said. These stories addressed the central question of the time. What is really going on in Nazi Germany? After all, I was there and saw everything with my own eyes. My reporting appeared on the front pages of newspapers in both the UK and the US. The Americans were afraid that their country would be drawn into a European war, and my notes on the state of affairs within the Third Reich caused a huge resonance. Moreover, I myself became part of history because of my unexpected and very extravagant escape. Everyone wanted to know the details of my adventure. As a result, App offered me a contract to write a series of articles about it. This provided for my family and I. Of course, these were not fees on the level of Hemingway or Fitzgerald, but the amount was very significant. The first thing I did was set aside a good portion of this money for Peter. His tests always showed that he was a genius, and we wanted to give him the best education. We had no intention of sending him to Eton or Harrow, although we could afford it now. But Imperial College was nearby, and there were plenty of talented graduate students there to hire as his tutors. Peter was special to me. He was technically another man's son, but he loved me, and we had so much in common that the old adage of nurture is more important than origin seemed especially true. As a child, I lived in the world of my thoughts. Peter, too. I was comfortable in this world, even if those around me considered me a little absent-minded and withdrawn. People would later call it alienation, but to be honest, I just didn't share the interests and values of most people. This can be called arrogance, but I did not judge anyone. I was simply not interested in what fascinated others, and thanks to my imagination, I could fly far beyond the boundaries of my reality. I wasn't going to, or maybe I just couldn't change. It was like an addiction. That's why I understood the oddities of my unusual son better than anyone else. Before I met Jane and Peter, I was not attached to anyone or anything. I could go anywhere and observe what was happening without getting involved in the situation. If that's the ideal temperament for a reporter, then so be it. However, this made me seem like a loner. Of course, the arrival of Jane and Peter completely changed these circumstances, and, as it seemed to me, for the better. Now I had a life partner, an equal person with whom I could share my worldview. Jane was stunningly beautiful, an exquisite little doll with a sexiness that would satisfy any man. But these physical qualities were such a small part of the woman I loved that they are hardly worth mentioning. The main thing was Jane herself. Without knowing anything about my wife's inner world, I felt that there was much more going on in her head than she allowed anyone to see. After all, Peter's intelligence had to come from somewhere, and by all accounts, Nigel was an ordinary person. Like me, Jane loved ideas and had a rich imagination. But unlike me, she had unbreakable principles. I never thought about what was right and what was wrong, I just did my job. But Jane did believe in the importance of such abstract concepts as politeness, courage, and loyalty, and she passed on all of these ideals to Peter. Of course, Peter's innate intelligence was fertile soil in which these concepts could take root and flourish. He was a recognized genius, all tests confirmed this. But he was distinguished from other boys not only by his intelligence, but also by his innate seriousness, dreamy nature, and romantic soul. At 10 years old, he should have been running through the streets and getting into trouble, but instead he sat at home, reading Scott, Kipling, Stevenson, Burroughs, and even H.G. Wells. It was in the worlds created by these authors that he wanted to be. This doesn't mean that my son was some kind of pampered weakling. He was taller than most boys and physically gifted, so there was not a single sport in which he would not excel. It was humiliating to lose to a 10-year-old boy in tennis. He was a lightning-quick winger in rugby and could bowl such a curvy ball in cricket that even adults couldn't hit it. But Peter had no interest in competitions unless the school forced him to participate. More than anything else, he loved to exercise his mind. When I was his age, I was exactly the same, too passionate about riding to play sports. Therefore, I did not have the slightest doubt that he was my son. I think it was our similarity, call it intelligence if you like, that was the connecting thread that tightly bound us to each other. But whatever the reason, I was raising a young man who wanted more than anything to grow up and become just like me. The love of a little boy is a huge incentive for any man, and it made my life happy. So I will always think that the best thing that happened to me was meeting Jane and Peter on the night of the bombing on the London Underground. And so everything went until December 7th, 1941. When the United States entered the war, events accelerated dramatically. At first, it was just the excitement surrounding the arrival of the first American troops in Britain. I also met a lot of new people in the press corps as American correspondents poured in. Some of them were recruits, college students like Andy Rooney from Colgate and Walter Cronkite straight out of the University of Texas. Others are seasoned professionals who were here because it was where the events unfolded, like Martha Gellhorn and Ernie Pyle. Both were veteran war journalists. In the end, it was Gellhorn's whirlwind affair with Hemingway during the Spanish Civil War that destroyed his marriage. I wasn't in the same league as Gellhorn or Pyle, but I was exempt from conscription because I had already covered the war for almost 2 years, and was also a minor celebrity due to my scandalous defection from the Reich. However, my exemption from the draft did not prevent me from becoming part of the army. I didn't mind it gave me more access, and since we were embedded in military units, we were given uniforms. It looked like an American officer's uniform, only with a war correspondent patch. So I often had to receive fireworks, although I was not officially an officer. From February to May, I covered the arrival of us Army Air Forces units. The strategic bombing campaign was due to begin in a month, but I sent almost daily reports on the preparations. I would take the train to High Wycombe in the morning, do interviews, and return in the evening to write and submit articles. And when the 8th Air Force began operations, all the correspondents selected different bomber groups and interviewed the crews as they returned from missions. This gave us the most severe feeling of survivor's guilt because on each mission, one or two crews did not return. I don't know whose idea it was, but we all decided to experience the bombing ourselves. Jane said I was an idiot. She had already lost one husband like that. Peter thought it was the most exciting adventure in the world. Reporters were prohibited from carrying weapons, but we were required to undergo a short but intensive training course for marksmen in case we needed to take their place in the air. I brought Peter a couple of .50 caliber shells. He was delighted. As I climbed into my B-17 that morning, I thought, what the hell am I doing here? I'm scared as hell. But I knew these guys, they did it every day. I felt like I had to try it at least once. I was placed in the center of the plane, along with the side gunners. The engineer was also there temporarily. He served the upper turret, but during the combat flight he was in front, next to the pilots. The lower turret gunner was also with us until he climbed into his hellish capsule. They gave me a bulletproof vest against shrapnel. But the plane had to keep a straight and level course while approaching the target, and we became a target. When the navigator announced that we were on a combat course, I took off my vest and stood on it. The right gunner, Elwood Barnes, who everyone called Hound, stared at me in amazement and said, "What the hell are you doing, Scheffler?" I answered, "I'm defending myself from anti-aircraft guns." The whole team with headphones on started laughing at me. The pilot said with good-natured ridicule, "The flake is coming from everywhere, mate, not just from below." He was right. Black clouds with bright fiery centers began to burst around us, and the fragments drummed against the skin like hail on a tin roof. I hastily pulled my vest back on. It was an experience I will never forget and never want to experience again. Obviously, the life of a bomber crew required incredible courage. Every person on our plane got up again the next morning while I slept next to my beautiful wife and set off at dawn to try my luck again. And in my opinion, this is what defines a hero. They had to fly 25 combat missions before being sent home. Short Snorter, the plane I flew, made 21 before being shot down by a Messerschmitt Bf 109 over Wilhelmshaven, joining the nearly 50% of aircrews who never returned. Speaking of heroes, the American soldiers were just guys, and like any group of young people, there were some smart ones and some stupid ones. So the usual drunk incidents happened from time to time, especially with women. The British joked that Americans were overpaid, overexcited, and all over the place. It was all fun as long as it didn't concern you personally. Jane was always modest and polite, but she stood out in any group of women. We rarely went to restaurants, the rationing was too strict. But Peter passed the exams required to enter Cambridge with flying colors, and we decided to celebrate. At 13 years old, Peter was no longer my little partner. He was almost the same height as me, thin but strong. He was polite, attentive, and courteous, unlike most teenagers, and his angelic features turned into masculine beauty. But even so, Peter was not a pretty boy. He radiated strength and self-confidence. I paid for dinner, and Jane and Peter went outside to wait for me. When I finished and walked out into the twilight, they were nowhere to be seen. Puzzled, I looked around. Then I heard loud laughter and ridicule from the alley. Curious, I walked around the corner of the building and saw a scene that made my heart sink. 3 drunken American privates cornered Jane and Peter. Jane must have walked around the building to get away from them, but they followed her, demanding, "Give us a kiss, baby." The English fight best when their backs are against the wall, and at that moment Peter was like the English archers at Agincourt or the thin red line of Highlanders saving Lord Raglan at Balaclava. My son knew he was just a boy facing three grown men, but honor and duty required him to stand and fight, and he clearly had no intention of retreating a single step. Peter shielded his mother, holding a piece of discarded wood like a cricket bat. His handsome face bore the same cool expression that Wellington must have worn as the fire from the British infantry squares tore the French cavalry to pieces at Waterloo. The three idiots laughed at his tenacity, but none of them came closer. I came up behind and barked with all my might. Huge, they were drunk, but they worked automatically. All three stood at attention. I ordered, all around. They turned, confused and puzzled. In the dim evening light, they saw an American officer standing before them. The Army gave me wings in honor of my one and only combat mission, and my soft cap was no different from those worn by American pilots. I wore it not because of any bravado, but to honor the memory of those guys on my crew. I had the right to do this. I looked death in the face with them. I said with icy contempt, "What the hell are you doing with these British civilians?" These three idiots were shaking in their boots. It was drilled into American soldiers that they must behave impeccably. We were here to help the British, but we remained their guests. They knew that I would smash them to smithereens. The one in the middle muttered, "No problem, sir. We were just having fun." I answered sharply, "Well, go and have fun somewhere else. And before you leave, apologize to the lady." They turned to Jane and muttered, burning with shame, "Sorry, ma'am, we didn't mean anything bad." Then they trudged away with their tails between their legs. All this time, Peter held his mother by the shoulders, protecting her. Jane, of course, looked absolutely calm and collected, as always. It was easy to see where Peter got his courage. My son looked at me and said, "I was just trying to delay them, father. I knew you would interfere. If you're lucky, you'll someday love a child the way I loved Peter." I thought, what 13-year-old boy uses words like detain and intervene? Most teenagers would either be bragging or bawling, but he's discussing his defensive strategy like Winston Churchill. The following June, the war began to decline sharply. I covered the Allied landings from a heavy cruiser Augusta, which was Bradley's headquarters ship. And during the breakthrough at St. Lo and in the Falaise Pocket, I shuttled between London and the rapidly advancing front. Patton loved the attention of the press, so it was because of him that I ended up with the French 2nd Armored Division when they broke away from the army and rushed to liberate Paris. This was an unauthorized operation. The Third Army was supposed to drive the Germans across the Rhine and not make a detour towards the capital. But de Gaulle was afraid that the Allies would introduce martial law in Paris after the liberation and wanted to get ahead of them by seizing control of the city. This is how I had the opportunity to meet my personal idol Hemingway. 4 of us war correspondents were traveling in a jeep through the town of Rambouillet, 35 miles southwest of Paris, when we were stopped by French partisans. They tried to commandeer our jeep. Bob Capra, who was driving, demanded to speak to their commander, and to our complete amazement, they brought out Hemingway. I recognized him immediately. I saw his photos on book covers. Dad stood in front of us with his shirt unbuttoned, his big belly hanging down, and he was sweating in the June heat. He held a bottle of red wine in one hand and drank from it as if it were a flask of water. He stated that took over the defense of Rambouillet and his troops, representing about 100 battered Frenchmen. Tomorrow they will liberate the Ritz Hotel. I just had to see this. So the next morning we followed a column of French Shermans heading to Paris. That night we camped in Moudon Forest and Ernie got drunk on some cheap scotch that Sam Marshall had. And in the morning we crossed the Pont de Sevres, dodging snipers, and entered Paris. By this time, Hemingway was drunk again. However, this is not surprising, given the amount of champagne he drank along the way. Honestly, it's a wonder we even made it this far, because the French were handing us bottles of wine. the moment we entered Bois de Boulogne. First of all, we released Harry's New York bar as the very place where the lost generation once gathered. Now it is run by a black guy named Tyler P. Boggs. Boggs was part of the legendary network Black Rattlesnakes, which was organized by the Office of Strategic Services. This was a group of African-American immigrants. Even Josephine Baker worked for them for a time. These people were invisible to the Nazis because they were considered just servants and artists. But at the same time, they heard and saw everything. In fact, rattlesnakes were the most valuable source of information about Paris for American intelligence. Meanwhile, the city itself was going crazy with happiness. The girls walked around in bright dresses, with large shiny earrings, and kissed everyone who passed by in the Jeep. People threw flowers, laughed, and sang. But the shootings have not stopped yet. Through all this joyful chaos, we heard the sounds of cannon shots and machine gun fire. Hemingway wore a belt with a pistol, which he took from a dead German during a shootout in 16th arrondissement of Paris. Now he was playing soldier, flagrantly violating all the rules prohibiting war correspondents from participating in combat operations. But of course, Dad was a celebrity. But we, including the ragtag band of French partisans whom he somehow recruited, did not. Late in the evening, our dusty convoy of several jeeps stopped at the rear entrance to Ritz Hotel on Rue Cambon. The manager ran out to meet us, nervously nodding his head as if it were attached to a string. He tirelessly assured us that the Ritz contributed to the resistance movement, saving the best wines from the Nazis. He repeated again and again, "We saved Chateau Cheval Blanc. We saved Chateau Cheval Blanc." Hemingway waved his hand irritably. Well, bring it already. So we spent the rest of the day sweating from the heat, telling stories about fictional military exploits, and drinking the rarest Bordeaux-like soda. I had hundreds of such stories. I wrote them all down and sent them via telegraph to my readers in the States. During the war, I led a double life. In London, I had a peaceful and happy family life, just a short flight on one of C-47, which non-stop shuttled between Le Bourget and Croydon. There in our cozy nest in Kensington, it was as if the war did not exist. But when I was in France, I daily faced violence and death. Even if I was with Patton, who rarely put himself in danger, I still saw destruction and death around me. It went on like this until one moment my life ended forever. I stayed at the Hotel Scribe, which had once served as the Paris headquarters of the Nazi propaganda ministry until we ink-stained newspapermen liberated it. Now, there were so many war correspondents gathered in the hotel bar that it looked like the editorial office of the Times. It was a couple of weeks before Christmas, and I had just finished breakfast. I was about to send a story about the British efforts to liberate Holland when the clerk on duty came up to me and said that I was calling from the States urgently. Puzzled, I headed to the phone counter. As I suspected, it was Wexler. He usually scurries around like a squirrel during nut-picking season, but his voice was distinctly calm and gloomy. My hair stood on end. I immediately realized that something terrible had happened. He said quietly, "Sit down before I tell you this." I sat down and said, with real fear in my voice, What's happened?" After that, I remember practically nothing. The point was that a V-2 rocket fell in London, and our house was at the very point of impact. Wexler learned of this first because one of his reporters was covering the incident, and Jim decided to break the news to me personally. The Nazis recently began using the weapon of vengeance, the V-2. These missiles were characterized by completely inaccurate aiming, so they were useless militarily. But it was the perfect weapon of terror. It simply appeared out of nowhere, like the finger of God, carrying a ton of amytal. And if you found yourself in the epicenter of the strike, you died. Nobody knew much about them, except that they were the height of vile cowardice. At least our allies took risks, breaking through anti-aircraft guns and fighters, bombing German cities. And the V-2 was launched from a safe distance, and the Nazi who pulled the trigger did not risk anything. I think people who have suddenly lost a loved one will understand how I felt then. It wasn't grief. Grief seems petty. It was acute, all-consuming despair and hopelessness. I only thought about why I should live further. I closed myself in my mind and locked myself from the inside. It was Wexler who sounded the alarm at the hotel. He shouted into the phone for several minutes. Hello, hello, did not receive an answer, hung up the phone and called the front desk. I was found in a phone booth in a catatonic state, clutching the receiver as if I wanted to crush it. I was neither and nor in tears. He just sat there like a statue. Psychiatrists call this fugue. I remember the sharp pain as the demons of regret ran and screamed in the empty corridors of my mind. But overall, I was dead until the next morning. I woke up in the American hospital in Paris. For a few seconds, I didn't understand where I was, and then I remembered everything and shouted, "Oh no!" The staff came running to my cry. I had already started to get dressed when a nurse entered the room. She said sternly, "You need to go back to bed, Mr. Scheffler." I replied, "I can't. I have to go to London and find a wife." Then I started putting on my boots. A few moments of confusion followed a couple of hefty orderlies and a doctor with a syringe, and I woke up only the next day in a slightly more adequate state. I came to terms with the idea that both Jane and Peter were dead, and with them all my meaning in life was gone. But I wasn't going to die. I wanted the Germans to kill me. I planned to go into places that would make Ernie Pyle look like a coward. Wexler knew what I was up to, but could not directly accuse me of wanting to die. So he assigned me to Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Reconnaissance Battalion. These were advanced fire spotters for the American 155 caliber long toms. This infuriated me because I wanted to be in the thick of things. Wexler believed that he had placed me far enough from the front line that I could not carry out my plan. How wrong he was. A week later, I was interviewing the battery commander for an article in Stars and Stripes when he received urgent orders to move the entire battery from Chevenhut to St. Vith. I asked why the entire Roman 7 Corps was moving south, and the commander did not know. Later that day, we found out that in the morning the Germans had launched a major offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, breaking through the Bulge area. We left Chevenhut at 8 o'clock the next day in jeeps and deuce-and-a-half trucks. We moved along country roads to the southwest, and then south through Einaton and Eupen, then through the Barak-Mitchell swamps to the crossroads north of Malmedy. It was a typical Belgian day, gloomy and cloudy, with an icy wind. Everyone who has ever served in this dismal country believes that it is there that God will turn on the hose if he decides to wash the earth with an enema. As we entered Malmedy, we were stopped by a colonel who reported that his patrol had seen a German tank column to the southeast. He warned the officers leading our column that it was better not to go any further. But these two stubborn idiots did not listen. I was sitting in the second jeep. I heard them arguing, saying that they had orders, and it was impossible for the Germans to go that far to the west. And we continued on for a few more miles along the road to Bonia, the place where 5 roads met. Naturally, we called this place 5 Points. The only building at the intersection was a cafe southwest of the road. Behind it were 2 farmyards, and another farm was located north of the road, a little south of the 5 Points intersection itself. This will play an important role for me later. Our column stretched half a mile from north to south, from my position in front to the crossroads behind. It was around noon. Visibility was lousy. Low clouds, temperatures just above zero, light snow and fog. In a word, a terrible thing. And then a shell from a tank gun from the absent Germans destroyed the first jeep. I later learned that we had stumbled upon the advanced troops of Battle Group Paper. It was commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper. His unit was the vanguard of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. She was ordered to break through to the Meuse River. Paper was known as a brilliant tank commander, but apparently he was terribly nervous that day. The first American units he encountered offered much more stubborn resistance than expected. As a result, he was 12 hours behind his attack schedule. We only had carbines and jeeps against the Tigers and Panthers. We did the logical thing. We hid in the ditches. The German tank stopped firing, and the tank commander waved his hand. indicating that we should surrender and go back along the road to the 5 points. By 14 o'clock, the Germans had herded 113 people into a snowy field next to the cafe. It was clear that Piper was furious about yet another delay. He yelled something to the guy in the tank for several minutes, who then got into one of the German half-track armored personnel carriers and drove up to us. Someone leaned out of the car, and then the shooting started. By 4:30, it was all over. The Germans left, leaving silence and a field strewn with mutilated bodies. I may have had a serious head injury, but I swear I wasn't delirious when I heard Jane's voice say in a whisper, "You must survive, my love. Peter and I will truly die only when everyone forgets us." These words struck me like an epiphany on Saul's road to Damascus. I couldn't let the memory of my loved ones simply fade away. Moreover, I was filled with rage at the inhumanity I had just witnessed. The world must know the barbarity we are facing. Therefore, lying face down in the frozen ground, I made an oath to myself. I am a journalist, and I will do everything so that the whole world knows about this atrocity, and Jane and Peter are never forgotten. It was already almost completely dark, and dead silence reigned. I carefully climbed out of the pile of bodies and stood up. The world rocked, and I immediately fell face down. My left leg almost didn't obey me, and I couldn't feel my left arm at all. I needed to hide. It was freezing, and there was a danger that the Germans would return. I somehow stood up, unsteadily, and took a step with my right foot. I advanced about 1.5 feet. Then I pulled up my unruly left leg, straightened up, and took another step. There was a barn nearby, less than 1/4 mile away, about 400 meters. Each step I took advanced me 1.5 feet. This means that we had to take about 880 steps. I had a cheap military watch with a luminous dial on my wrist, and I decided to monitor my progress in time. It took me 10 seconds to take one step. This means that to cover the distance, it will take a little more than 140 minutes, that is, 2.5 hours. It seemed unreal. But Jane and Peter were counting on me, and I couldn't let them down. As I staggered around, I began to hallucinate. I understood that if I stopped, the frost would kill me. It was well below zero outside in the dark. I clearly felt like Jane was supporting me on one side and Peter on the other. This gave me strength, and finally I made it to the barn door, where I buried myself in a huge pile of hay. I instantly fell asleep, or maybe lost consciousness. I woke up to the sound of an engine outside the walls of the barn. Sunlight was shining through the cracks in the boards. It was already morning time. The left side still did not obey, but I managed to turn over and hobble to the crack to look out. And lo and behold, I saw an American Jeep and 2 soldiers. I tried to scream, but only made some strange hoarse sounds. Apparently, this is how I called them for help. The Jeep stopped, and a minute later I felt strong arms picking me up. A voice was heard. "We'll get you out, buddy. Everything will be fine." In my head, I heard Jane's voice. "We did it, love." These were guys from the unit defending Malmedy. The same colonel who warned the 2 fools heard the sounds of battle and sent reconnaissance to find out what had happened. They had already stumbled upon that terrible field, and now they decided to explore the area around to find possible survivors. I was taken along the standard evacuation chain to the battalion medical center, then to the field hospital, then to the general hospital in Paris. All that time I remained almost insane. I had emergency surgery to correct a depressed skull fracture that was causing my left side to be unable to function. There was no bleeding in the brain, so the doctors put a metal plate and returned me to the general ward. Now I had to avoid metal detectors and strong magnets. I woke up in paradise. It must have been heaven because Jane was holding my hand and Peter was looking at me with concern. As soon as I opened my eyes, Jane began to cry. She seemed so real. She turned around and said, "Sisters." He woke up. "Sister, why is there a nurse in heaven?" A friendly woman in starched white, all business, immediately approached. She took my pulse and shone a flashlight in my eyes. "It hurts. Does anything hurt in heaven? Maybe I'm not in heaven at all." I asked anxiously. "Where am I?" The nurse smiled sympathetically. "You are in the intensive care ward of the 194th Evacuation Hospital at the Lycée Claude Bernard, Mr. Scheffler. Your wife and son are here because your editor managed to reach an agreement with our command." I looked at Jane or her ghost and said, "Are you real?" Jane burst into tears, squeezing my hand even tighter. "Of course it's real, fool. What makes you think that this is not so?" I replied. "But Wexler said that our entire neighborhood was wiped off the face of the earth." Jane laughed. "Yes, if we were there, it would definitely hurt us. But Peter and I went to Cambridge to sort out his room at King's. He was given early admission. Have you forgotten?" Then she casually added what she often said when I forgot something. "You never remember things like that." Jane never understood that I was sure of their death, and I decided not to go into details. I just looked at her madly. She continued, "When I returned, I saw one large crater on the site of our house." She smiled bitterly. "We should probably get used to it." Then she added seriously, "I sent you a V-mail telling you about everything." I guess I wouldn't have received it until a month later. Jane's face darkened. "And then they told me that you were wounded." I immediately called Mr. Wexler and begged him to help me get to you. He made an agreement with the army. He said he had an obligation to you, although I don't know what exactly he meant. I understood what he meant. It all happened because of a tragic mix-up and a series of unfortunate coincidences. When a ton of explosives falls on a house, there are no bodies left. So the authorities simply assumed. Wexler was almost the first to hear about this. He knew how I would react to the loss of my family and decided to break the news to me personally. In general, he wanted to do a good deed, although it led to disaster. After all, the very next day, when Jane and Peter resurrected and got in touch, no one told him anything. He remained in the dark until Jane herself called, asking for help to fly her to Paris. So yes, Wexler owes me a debt. While I was being evacuated from St. Vith, Wexler used all his contacts to transport Jane and Peter in a military C-47 to Le Bourget. Meanwhile, I was suffering from hellish pain in my head, but it was the happiest moment in my life. Jane was horrified by my terrible injuries, but I was alive, and the main thing is that we are together again, and apparently my brains are in the right place. Peter stayed away the entire time, shy as always. I beckoned him with the hand free from Jane's. He came up and I said, "You did everything you had to do, son. I'm proud of you." Peter's face instantly transformed. He turned from the Knight of Ivanhoe into a frightened boy. He threw himself on my chest, bursting into tears. "I thought I lost you, Dad." His mother hugged him from the other side of the bed, and the three of us began to cry. Several weeks passed, and the doctors had no doubt that there were no serious consequences. I had already written an article about the Malmedy massacre by December 28th, that is, just 10 days after the rescue. Jane was typing on a typewriter right next to my bed because I was still too weak. But the world had to know about the massacre. The article appeared in Stars and Stripes on Friday. The news of the mass shooting instantly spread among American units. As my colleagues told me, after that almost no SS soldiers were taken prisoner. The fact of my survival made me a minor celebrity again. It's strange how a simple situation of being captured and shot can turn you into a hero. But I turned out to be one of the few living witnesses, and the story was in demand. I hired a literary agent and received a hefty advance for the book. It wasn't crazy money, but for Jane and me, it was a huge amount that we had never dreamed of. In addition, I was actually taken out of the army. More precisely, I was not in the army, but now Wexler did not allow me to go to the front line, and the military did not want to deal with a man with a plate in his head. So I stayed behind and wrote for the Associated Press. We lived in Paris because I had to go to the American hospital for rehabilitation. We rented housing on Guynemer Street, opposite the Luxembourg Gardens. After our modest previous homes, this seemed like incredible luxury. In March in Paris, it is not yet as romantic as in May, but the grass is already turning green, the first leaves and flowers are appearing. Once we were sitting in the Luxembourg Gardens, not far from a small copy of the Statue of Liberty. You ask, the Statue of Liberty? Yes, there is an exact copy of it, only about 10 meters high. It was from this model that the one that now stands in New York was made. Peter was leaving for the spring semester at Cambridge the next day, and this was a major milestone for the 15-year-old boy. But our son was very calm and mature. It was also an emotional moment for Jane and me, as a whole part of our lives was disappearing into the past. I think all parents understand these feelings when you look at a grown-up child and see that little one. Peter was already taller than me and began to grow stronger. The sweet angelic voice managed to break and became a soft male baritone, but he still felt that masculine beauty that was always inherent in him. Perhaps it was for this reason that a girl playing with two other kids approached him. I say girl because she looked about 8 or 9 years old, tiny. But at the same time she behaved with the confidence and courage of General de Gaulle. She approached Peter and asked, "Will you walk with me?" Peter was embarrassed and answered in broken French, "Don't speak French." She immediately switched to English. "Would you like to take a walk in the garden with me?" A petite blonde with bright blue eyes and an angelic appearance, but at the same time amazingly self-confident. Soon her mother ran up to her along with the other two girls. That woman was extraordinarily beautiful, huge brown eyes and a flawless face. With her charm, she reminded me of my wife, except that Jane had a calm, reliable energy, and this lady had that same French je ne sais quoi elusive sophistication and chic. She addressed us in perfect English. "Sorry about Josette. She's like a 25-year-old woman trapped in the body of an 8-year-old girl. She doesn't feel like she's only 8. I laughed. "My son is the same. You could say they are kindred spirits," the woman added. "Josette is very persistent and courageous if she decides something. Nothing is stopping her, and she seems to like your son. Peter is filled with paint of the most beautiful shade. I noticed. Maybe someday they will meet again, but he's leaving for Cambridge tomorrow." The woman was surprised. "He's too young for university," I explained. 2 years younger than a regular applicant, yes, but they believe that he is already ready for the advanced program. We, of course, also want to give him every opportunity. And I thought to myself that it was this decision that saved the lives of Peter and Jane. The woman took her daughter away. As she left, she turned around and said, "Good luck, Peter." And Josette shouted loudly, "I'll see you again." Our bedroom had access to a stone balcony. In the evenings, Jane and I loved to sit there, admiring the Luxembourg Gardens. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they just held hands, enjoying each other's closeness. But there was an elephant in the room between us. Or rather, an important thing that I hid from my wife, and I hated myself for it. Jane thought my injury was the result of stupidity, but I was afraid to tell her the truth. How to admit such weakness and not lose her respect? I've always had a hard time sharing my feelings. Peter inherited the same quality. He is English, after all. It is part of his mentality. But for me, perhaps the whole point is that I've seen enough of Westerns where the hero never reveals his soul. One way or another, I was unable to admit to my wife, "You know, I decided to die when I found out that you were no more." One evening, when it was atypically warm for March, and we were drinking an excellent glass of Bordeaux, I suddenly blurted out, "I need to tell you something." Jane looked in fear. She seemed to expect me to say something along the lines of, "I like men," or "I want you to wear a leather collar." I continued, "You probably wondered why I was so close to the front line when I was wounded." She looked puzzled, but relieved. "Well, yes, I thought about it. I thought you were learning something again, like when you flew on the bombing mission." Then she softened and said with love, "I see that this is tormenting you. So I forgive you in advance, whatever it is." I muttered, "What if I say that I wanted to die?" She turned pale and whispered, "What?" I, feeling the same unbearable horror as then, said, "I was sure that you and Peter were dead. I simply could not live without you," and covered his face with his hands. I was ashamed to look at her. Jane, shocked, said, "Lord, did you think we were in the house?" I nodded, feeling guilty. Yes, Wexler called and said that the whole block had been destroyed. I've lost my mind. It seemed to me that the only way out was to die with you. I looked into her shocked eyes and finished almost audibly. I didn't want to live a day without you and Peter. Jane whispered in horror, "My God, this is a nightmare." And then I realized that she was not judging me. On the contrary, she looked as if she was deeply sympathetic. We were both silent, and then she made a subtle movement with her hand, as if she understood everything. She approached, took my hand, and led me to our bedroom. With the moonlight streaming through the open French doors, she stood next to the bed. Silently throwing off the light dress from her shoulders, she allowed it to slide to the floor. Then she unclasped her bra, taking off her shoes at the same time, and took off her modest panties. Then she lay down on the bed and patted the place next to her with her hand. "Lie with me. We haven't made love since early December." Well, more accurately, Jane wasn't dead, but I walked around in bandages like a mummy for a month. The head now gleamed with a bald scar with a metal plate, slowly growing over with short hair. But everything else was fine, including one very important function. I ran my hand over her face, and we both looked into each other's eyes. Jane said quietly, "We're together now, that's all that matters," and kissed me tenderly. Some people may not understand the difference in this kiss, but this kiss did not express lust, but love and understanding, support and confidence that everything will be fine with us after all, we are together. We lay looking into each other's eyes, intimately connected. Jane's intense sexuality was her precious gift to me, but this gift was the result of her own choice, and not something she did under duress. Jane allowed a man into the carefully guarded sphere of her true feelings only when she considered him worthy. Now she told me that our closeness was a confirmation of her absolute commitment to me. We both experienced the shock of loss. I lost Jane due to a misunderstanding, and she almost lost me for a much more prosaic, but no less painful reason. Now this turning point is behind us, and we have created an unbreakable bond. Love is a frivolous and carefree thing. You can go with its flow into a marriage that will last a lifetime, but this life can be as superficial as it is unsatisfying. And yet, few truly happy people manage to achieve anything much more meaningful than simple romance. This quality is called loyalty. Devotion has nothing to do with temporary feelings. Devotion is the anchor that holds your existence on the solid ground of solidarity. Another person willingly takes on the hardships of life with you, and the two of you face the inevitable consequences of being human. This unity of souls is accompanied by the most intimate act, sex. Sex is la petite mort, the little death. But the true meaning of this expression is much more metaphysical. It describes the primordial state into which people fall during the act. Essentially, sex allows both partners to connect on a fundamental level, stripped of all the pretense of civilization. Sometimes this is meaningless animal intercourse, and sometimes a deep affirmation of devotion to each other. That's what sex was like for Jane and me, priceless. We were no longer just a man and a woman. We became two similar souls, frolicking in the ocean of sensations, enjoying our unity. She took my hand and whispered passionately, "Until death do us part. Don't be afraid of it, my love." I answered her with the same sincerity. Not a second sooner. I knew that our life would be calm, and Peter would become our bright guiding star. But the main thing was the simple realization that I was not alone. We will face our future together until the days of our lives are spent, and in the end, that's the only thing that really matters. The war ended and the counting began. The Wehrmacht vied with each other to surrender to the Americans, knowing full well what awaited them if they fell into the hands of the Red Army. Herr Paper was captured by Patton's men in Bavaria and sent to a prison camp. Since he was in the Waffen-SS, he was quickly called in for questioning. When asked about his political views, he stated bluntly, "All Jews are evil. We cleansed our society and sent them to camps, and you released them." His honesty in this matter instantly marked him as incorrigible. Meanwhile, an investigation into war crimes related to the Malmedy massacre began. Paper's campgrup was identified as the culprit, and the Americans began searching for those involved. It was like searching for a needle in a huge pile of needles after all. There were 3 million German prisoners of war in custody. However, thanks to Paper's tireless venting of his views on Jews, Poles, and the stupidity of the Americans who refused to include the SS in their army, he attracted the attention of the right people. He was court-martialed, and in Piper's case, military justice was not an oxymoron. He claimed that he was not present during the Malmedy massacre, but unfortunately for him, there were several witnesses. That is why, in May 1946, Jane and I visited the lovely town of Dachau. Dachau is located on the Amper River in Upper Bavaria, a charming town like something out of a fairy tale with a small Baroque palace and a huge Nazi concentration camp. The trial took place in one of the buildings of the former camp, which, in my opinion, was creepy. We, the 6 survivors, were called as witnesses. We took turns sitting on a chair next to the female stenographer and telling the court-martial of 7 American officers what we had seen. I carefully studied the faces of the defendants. Paper sat in the front row among the senior Waffen-SS officers. He looked bored. I said that I saw him scolding the guy in the tank, which means he probably gave the order. But by the time of the execution, he had already moved further down the road. Fortunately, his presence at the crime scene did not matter. He was the commander, and that was enough. 43 of these scoundrels were sentenced to death, including Piper. It was the least that the dead deserved, and the most we could hope for. After the trial, I went to the hotel and got drunk. Of course, the right decision always loses when politics and justice collide. The Americans needed West Germany as a bulwark against rising communism in Eastern Europe, and therefore the sentences of German war criminals were revised. As a result, in 1948, Piper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and in 1956, it was completely reduced to, "He's already served enough." As they say, justice is blind. In the meantime, I made enough money publishing my war memoirs that I stopped chasing sensations and just wrote columns for major publications like the Times and Post. It was 1956, the height of the Cold War. Events were happening in the world that were much more important than the release of some Nazi functionaries. In fact, I didn't even hear of Piper until 8 years later. In 1964, renowned Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal accused his SS henchmen of crimes against Italian Jews. They wrote about it in the newspapers because Wiesenthal said, "Finding out he was still alive gave me a new obsession." The fact is that the SS had its own version of the VFW, an organization of war veterans. Only this was not a club of older guys sitting in a dilapidated hall, drinking beer and reminiscing about their youth. The SS version was an open pack of racists and anti-Semites who still kept old photographs of Hitler in their closets. To make matters worse, among these bastards, there were people who took good positions in West German industry. They managed to get Piper into Porsche, where he successfully climbed the career ladder. This news infuriated me, and I wrote several devastating articles that could have made even the prophet Jeremiah green with envy. Of course, I couldn't openly declare a hunt for Piper. A journalist loses his reputation if he loses objectivity. That's why I made a series of materials about Heinrich Himmler. Everyone hated Himmler. Besides, he was already dead. Piper was his senior aide-de-camp, which means his name came up time after time in my publications. The 1960s were the hunting season for former Nazis, Eichmann, Mengele, Barbie, Wolf, and Grothman. In the end, the pressure became so noticeable that Paper left Germany and settled in France. I think he hoped to get lost, which was as naive as our faith in salvation that day in Malmedy. But a good journalist doesn't beat his victim over the head with a story. The last thing you want is to turn your prey into a martyr. Instead, you gently push the reader to the desired conclusion. That's what I did with Piper. I was going to haunt him for the rest of his life. And for almost 10 years, I wore him down. My masterpiece was a touching article in the international press under the heading, "What Happened to?" It was about a famous Nazi criminal who lived peacefully in the tiny French village of Traves, Haute-Saône. I don't know whether my article caused subsequent events, but I want to believe it. Shortly after publication, the house of the former SS Obersturmbannführer was firebombed. This happened on July 14, 1976 Bastille Day. I hope the 86 American soldiers killed by paper at Malmedy found peace that night. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.